in that, but we didn't have this class, so it's been a couple weeks now. And I want to wrap up the conversation this week on the Bishop's Bible, and we'll look at lesson 143, the Bishop's Bible, Linguistic Features and Later History. I don't have a ton of introduction for this lesson. We're just going to kind of get right into the main points and just kind of see how long this takes this morning. This is, I think, our 7th lesson on the Bishop's Bible, and it's my plan that this would be the last one, and so seven is the number of perfection, so this teaching on the Bishop's Bible cannot be improved upon, right? Okay. Joking, okay. So one thing about teaching at school with a mask on, you can't pick up on sarcastic face when I tell a joke or something. The kids are looking at me like, is he serious? Anyway, linguistic features is the first point. Since the 1602 Bishop's Bible served as the base text for the King James Bible, it is important to note some of the linguistic features of the Bishop's Bible. So we'll just stop there. We already know that the 1568 Bishop's Bible was revised in 1572, and then that was the one that was reprinted in 1602 and given to the King James translators as the base text according to Rule 1. The first lesson we did on the Bishop's Bible established that fact. We looked at primary documents, historical documents that established beyond doubt that the translators were working off of a 1602 Bishop's Bible as their base text. So the King James is related intimately then with the Bishop's Bible. So since that's the case, I think it's important to acknowledge some of the linguistic features of the Bishop's Bible, which then are probably going to impact the King James. Okay, so let's look at the next sentence. Many of the forms and manners of speaking that were popularized by the King James Bible find their origin in the Bishop's Bible and other pre-1611 English translations. Regarding the matter, Blackford Conant states the following in his 1882 book, The History of the English Bible. He says, quote, "The Bishop's Bible, like all other early English versions, did not adopt the fashionable speech of the time." So what does that mean? Were they intending to speak using the modern colloquial speech of the Englishman, or were they trying to speak intentionally using older, more precise forms and features of the English language? Okay? So they're not intending to make a Bible that's going to read like people talked in the street. They were intending to make a Bible that would sound like what? The Scripture, right? That would have a certain majesty to it, that it would not just be like reading a newspaper kind of a thing. So the Bishop's Bible is also adopting a principle of not following fashionable speech. Okay? The rule laid down by Archbishop Matthew Parker was that the plain words of the Great Bible should be retained, excepting in cases where the original Hebrew and Greek demanded a change. This wise restriction was much needed in that age, for scarcely even before in the history of the English tongue was it so threatened with such an overwhelming tide of affection and pedantry. So what that's saying is, was the language already being sort of devalued at that time? So I mean, we look at the English language today, and let me just make this point, right? So where do you think the language is more majestic, in the King James Bible or in the modern speech of the average American?
King James.
The King James Bible, right? Well, this is the case with every language, right? There's always a devaluing of a language that occurs over time, where words are devalued, the meanings get confused, people use words all sorts of different ways, right? In ways that, things aren't intended. This is a really big problem in our day, right? When we think about even in theological speech. For example, progressive Christianity is redefining all sorts of biblical terminology according to their understanding of doctrine, and then they use the terminology, and unless you understand that they have redefined the words, you're going to miss what's going on, and you're going to assume they're talking about something that you agree with, okay? Well, that type of language shifting was already happening in the 1500s, is what the point Condit is making here. And the bishop's Bible, Matthew Parker, the archbishop who's responsible for the bishop's Bible largely, is aware of it, and therefore his rule to keep the Great Bible speech as often as possible was the rule that was set forth for the bishop's Bible. Elegance, refinement were studied at the expense of sense and clearness. Language was used for the sake of sound and appearance, appealing to the fancy rather than to the understanding. This newfangled English was not a little influential. But to the credit of the revisers of the bishop's Bible, they put it not a shred of this fashion either in cut or color. In avoiding this over refinement, they sometimes went the opposite extreme of too great familiarity in the choice of words and phrases, which detract from the elevated tone benefiting the language of the Holy Scriptures. Befitting, sorry. So what that's saying is, even the bishop's Bible, which is the forerunner of the King James, is it done at a time when the English language is shifting. Okay, there's a lot of changes that are happening during that time when the bishop's Bible is translated. Go to the next page. On page 285 and 286, Condit provides the following list of examples of these linguistic phenomena. So what I want to do is I want you to grab your King James Bible, and I want to look at what the examples are, and then I want to compare them with the King James. So the first one, dealing with some Roman numerals here. So hopefully those of you that are watching can see that. We want Psalms 3, verse 7. Psalms 3, verse 7 is the first example that we're going to look at. Psalms 3, verse 7. And again, this is taken from Condit, pages 285 and 286 of Condit. But we want Psalm 3. I need to stop talking and just find it. Psalm 3, verse 7. Okay, so let's look at the notes first. Okay, so here's the example that he gives. Up, Lord, and help me, O my God. This is after the Great Bible, 1540. So did the bishop's Bible retain the reading from the Great Bible? It did. That's what that means. Okay? And ignores the Geneva Bible, 1560, which reads, O Lord, arise, help me, my God. So the bishop's Bible retains the top sentence, Up, Lord, and help me, O my God. The Geneva Bible had changed it to, O Lord, arise, help me, my God. Let's look at what the King James does. Notice what they do. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Notice how the King James strikes a middle way between what the Great Bible had, between what the bishops and the Great Bible had, and what the Geneva Bible had. Okay? So, I'm seeing confused faces. So this first phrase, Up, Lord, and help me, O my God, that is the reading of the Great Bible and the bishop's Bible. The Geneva Bible said it, O Lord, arise, help me, my God. The King James takes the bishops and the Geneva and it weaves them together and it walks a line between them. Verse 7, Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God. Okay? Do you see how that's happening there? So the King James is taking the bishop's Bible and it's taking the Geneva Bible and it's like shaving them off and meeting them halfway in the reading that it puts in the text in that verse. Does everybody see what I'm talking about? Okay, let's look at another one. Let's go to Psalm 9. Psalm 9, verse 19. So let's look at the notes first. Again, we see this. So, up, Lord, and let not man have the upper hand. So that's what the Great Bible and the Bishop's Bible read in that verse. The Geneva version reads, let not man prevail. Okay, so let's look at the King James, verse 19. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let not the heathen be judged in thy sight. So the King James in that verse, is it following the Bishop's Bible or is it revising it to the Geneva Bible reading there? It's accepting the Geneva Bible reading in that case. Let's go to chapter 10. Let's look at verse 6. Psalm 10. Let's look at verse 6. Let's look at the notes first. For he hath said in his heart, thus, I shall never be cast down. This is after the Great Bible of 1540. King James, chapter 10, verse 6. Chapter 10, verse 6, and he has said in his heart, I shall not be what? Moved. For I shall never be in adversity. So there's a change there. There's a change there from for he saith. Sorry, it's hard to read some of this. For he has said in his heart, thus I shall never be cast down. This is after the Great Bible of 1540. So the point here, the point that Condon is making is the Great Bible retaining that reading from, is the Bishop's Bible retaining that reading from the Great Bible, even if it's a little bit weird sounding. Okay? Do we need to look at more of these, or do we get the point? Let's look at one more. Let's go to, let's see, this would be 28. Let's go to Psalm 28, verse 8. Psalm 28, verse 8. Psalm 28, verse 8. So let's look at the notes first. So we're right here. Therefore mine heart, I'm going to say this is danceth for joy. I would read this danceth, okay? So the Great Bible, Bishop's Bible reading at the end of verse 8 is, therefore my heart danceth for joy. All right? So we're in chapter 28, verse 8, King James, chapter 28, verse 8. The Lord is their strength. Is that the right verse?
I don't think so.
XX would be 20, right?
Mm-hmm.
V would be 25. And 3 I's would be 28, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's
But it
correct,
must
but
be a
it
mistake.
doesn't seem to be joining up.
Yeah, so there must be a misprint there in what Condon had. So anyway, I apologize for that. Do we want it? Let's
Let's try the other one.
let's try the other one. So that'd be 33:3, right?
Yeah.
Let's try that one, see if we do better with that one.
That's
I like it when the mistake is somebody else's, not mine.
it's a beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing. All right, 33:3. Sing unto the Lord a new song, sing praises. Now look at this word, lustily unto him. Now that sounds weird, but is that what it says?
Yep.
Okay? Sing unto the Lord a new song, sing praises lustily with a good courage. The Geneva version, and I think I might have, let's go to the next, did I accidentally cut something off there? The Geneva version is going to read something different, so let's see what the King James says there. Verse 3. Sing unto him a new song, play skillfully with a loud noise. This, sing praises what? Lustily unto him with a good courage. So obviously, has the King James really changed that reading? That's one of my favorite verses anyway, with a loud noise. Anyway, well, we won't get into all that, right? So we can skip the rest of these. There's a bunch more examples here. Actually, why is that duplicated? That's the same stuff, isn't it?
Are you looking at your original?
Oh, did I have that in there twice?
Yeah, I took it out.
Okay. So let's go underneath. Let's go to page 2 underneath that, okay? So we can see there, what's my point in showing you that? Let me make sure I'm clear about this. When they revised the Bishop's Bible, when they revised the Great Bible and turned it into the Bishop's Bible, did they retain old ways of speaking, like talking about singing to the Lord lustily? All right, that just sounds really weird, right, to say it that way, but that was the way the Great Bible had it, and they didn't change it when they translated the Bishop's Bible. This other one will be more clear. Another example is the use of the extended verb ending ETH. Imagine reading 1 Corinthians 13 without the extended verb endings. Professor Leland Rankin addresses this in his book, The Legacy of the King James Bible. He says, quote, "The passage flows in a wave-like cadence out of the rise and fall of sound. The passage also shows how the unaccentuated ETH verb endings keep the rhythm flowing smoothly. Robbed of these verb endings, modern translations bump along in staccato fashion. Okay, now here's a little exercise that I want to do. All right, I'm going to load Blue Letter Bible, and I'm going to read this passage out of the ESV. Okay, so we're going to go to 1 Corinthians 13. Whoops. I'm going to switch it to the ESV because that's the popular one now that everybody likes, even more so than the NIV. And I want you guys to just close your Bible. You don't have to close your Bible, but just don't read along, but just listen to me reading it out loud. Okay? Could somebody get the back door so we're not distracted by the loud noises coming from the skillfully played loud noises coming from the auditorium? All right, so I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you guys to just listen to it read. Okay, so here's the ESV, 1 Corinthians 13. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains, but I have not love, I am nothing. If I give away all I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away, and as for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was a child, I spoke like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then shall I know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Okay? Now, I would say that the ESV even reads better than the NIV. So now I'm going to read it in the King James. So let's go to 1 Corinthians 13. And I will read it out loud, and I just want you to listen audibly to it being read again. Okay, so I'm going to read it now from the King James, 1 Corinthians 13. For though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil. Rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, and these three, but the greatest of these is charity. Does it sound different when you read it with the old verb endings? Okay? Does it, the cadence and the flow and the rhythm is intact, and it's more visible and appealing, I would say, when you read it with the old verb endings. Okay? So this characteristic feature, so let's go back to this point here. This characteristic feature of the King James was preceded by the initial decision of the bishop's translation to retain these forms and manners of speaking. Consider the following table comparing the Tyndale, Great, Bishop's, and King James readings of 1 Corinthians 13. Please note that I bolded all the extended verb endings so that they will stand out. Okay, so let's look at the table here. So we got Tyndale, the Great Bible, the Bishop's, and then King James, right? So the Bishop's is a revision of which one? The Great Bible there, right? So I want to point a couple things out to you. Again, so here's Tyndale. Though I spake with the tongues of men and of angels, and yet had no love, I were even as sounding brass or as a tinkling cymbal. Great Bible. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have no love, I am even as a sounding brass or as a tinkling cymbal. The original Bishops from 1568. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not love, I am as sounding brass or as a tinkling cymbal. King James. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become as a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. In that verse, what is the most obvious difference between the King James and the previous three? Charity. The King James is using what word? Charity. All of the other ones, including Tyndale, are using what word? Love. We've already studied this, right? When did charity come into the text? It came into the text in this passage in 1572 with that second edition revision of the King James. Before that, every single one of them, Tyndale, Coverdale, Matthew's Bible, Great Bible, Geneva Bible, Bishop's Bible, they all had what word? Love. Not what? Charity. Okay? So let's go down and let's look at verse 3. Notice, Tyndale. What word does he have here? I have it bolded. Profiteth. Great Bible. What word? Profiteth. Bishops. Profiteth. King James what? So here's what I want you to see. This feature, this extended verb ending in your King James Bible, this ETH extended verb ending that people complain about in modern readings of the Bible, right? Oh, it's too hard, I can't understand it. You know, stuff people say about it, right? Oh, they don't like it. When the King James is using it, you need to understand, was that predated by nearly 100 years as a form of speaking in the English language before the King James translators used it here?
It was.
It was. So the King James is not doing anything new by using the extended verb ending. What they're doing is they're keeping the old form that had existed for a long what? For a long time. Okay? And I would say to you, and Rakin makes the point, if you read more of his book, the guy I quoted from there from page 140, that these verb endings were already falling out of usage at the time the King James translators did this. But they elected to keep it that way with the extended verb ending precisely for the reason that I tried to illustrate to you by reading the ESV aloud versus reading the King James aloud. They thought that it sounded what? Better. They thought that there was more rhythm, that there was more cadence in it by keeping those older forms. So what I'm trying to show you is this form that you're familiar with in a King James that everybody complains about was really a form that was first used by who? Tyndale, and probably people before who?
Tyndale.
Before Tyndale. So it's already nearly 100-year precedent in the English Bible of using words with the extended what? Verb ending on them by the time you get to the King James Bible. Yeah.
Was the critics saying that it should have been, in this case, profit mean nothing? Or how would they have preferred it?
So let's clarify what we mean here by critics. Are we talking about critics in the early 17th century, or are we talking about critics today in the 21st century?
Either one, because right now I'm not seeing any difference.
So back here, when I say back here, what I mean is in the early 17th century when the King James was done, no one would have said boo about this.
Okay.
Because that was just the way the Bible had read for, nearly 100 years in English since Tyndale first printed one in 1526. Okay? So, on the street speech in the early 17th century, they might not have said it profiteth, they might have said prophet or something like that in the everyday colloquial speech of the Englishmen on the street in the early 17th century. But no scholar or person related to the scripture is going to reject to that form in an English Bible in the early 17th century. The people today that complain about it because they whine that it's too old and it's hard to understand. That's essentially what they're whining about. Okay? My point is, the thing that they're identifying as a problem is really a form that way predates the King James Bible as a method of communicating in English what the biblical text says, with that extended verb ending on an ETH. So then if you look at the rest of the verses here, you can see very plainly from my bolding, verse 4 has 4 verbs in it with extended verb endings, and all 4 of them have the same, and there's a slight difference here. They use swelleth, swelleth, swelleth. The King James says puffed up here. So there's a slight difference here, but every time you have one of the verbs in the extended verb endings, is it the same all the way back to Tyndale? Okay? And you see that in verse 4, you see that in verse 5 with seeketh and thinketh. You see that in verse 6 with rejoiceth. You see that in verse 7 with suffereth, believeth, hopeth, endureth. King James says beareth instead of suffereth, but same obviously means the same thing. But you have all of these, there's this chunk of them right there in the meat of that section where it's talking about charity, and they're all there, they're all compact together, and they move the passage along as you hear it read out loud in English, okay? So, and then obviously if you go to the last verse, so then you have a bunch of verses where there are no verb endings, but then if you go to the last verse, verse 13, you see it again at the end of that chapter. Okay? So, what we would identify in modern American 21st century speech as an old form was already a form that had been in use for nearly 100 years in the English Bible before the King James translators did their work. And they retained these old forms. And one of the reasons why they retained these old forms is because they were retained in the bishops, and the bishops was the base text for the King James, and so they saw no need to alter any of these things, or change them, or restate them using more modern English. Okay? Anyone got any questions or comments about that?
I think the King James scholars purposely wanted it to sound more,
I absolutely agree with that.
yeah.
Yes. I've said this before, we'll study this more later when we get to it. The last thing these guys did is they sat in a room like this, and a guy stood at a lectern with the text in front of him, and he read it out loud. And everyone just sat there and listened to it being read out loud. And then if something didn't sound quite right, or if somebody objected to a particular translation, they would raise their hand, and then they would discuss what the objection was, and then decide if they wanted to change it or keep it the way it was. But the last thing they did was an audible read. And they were reading it from the standpoint of how it would sound when it was read out loud. I'll just tell you my own personal opinion. You don't have to agree with it if you don't want to. When I sit in a church, and when I go to another church for a funeral or something like that, and they're not using a King James, and I hear things being read, it doesn't ring true to me when I hear it read the way that the King James rings hits my ears and the way it sounds when I hear it read. You could say that's biased, you could say that's my own personal preference, fine, but that's the way I feel about it. I'm like, that just didn't sound the way that it should sound. The King James, when it's read out loud, sounds majestic. To me. You could disagree, yeah.
It doesn't sound like it was written yesterday.
It doesn't sound like it was written by two bumpkins walking around at the market. That's not what it sounds like. It doesn't sound like you're reading the New York Times. It sounds like the way God would speak if he was speaking it in English. Yeah.
Did they give any reasoning for changing love to charity?
So, first of all, the King James translators did not make that change. That was changed in 1572 in the second edition of the Bishop's Bible. Okay, so remember, Bart, when I started this, I told you that this column here was the original Bishop's Bible?
Oh,
Okay, so if you look at that column, you're going to see love in it because I gave you the original 1568 reading, but in 1572 it switched in like 28 spots. They switched love to charity, and then of course it stayed that way into 1602 when the text is printed and then handed to the translators. So the translators are inheriting a text, a bishop's text, that has the word charity in it 28 times. Or something like that. My number, I'm going from memory on that number, so I might not be totally accurate. So it already had that word in it X number of times, and they just simply elected to keep it that word and not switch it back to love in those 28 times. But the decision to change it had already been made before they inherit the project.
do you have any understanding of why it was done in 1572?
I have some understanding, but not everybody's going to like it.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what it is since you asked. If you go back further than that to the late 1380s, when Wycliffe is translating the Bible out of Latin, he's translating out of Latin, and when you translate it out of Latin, the word in Latin is charity. So almost every place in the text that you have charity, Wycliffe said charity basically nearly every time that word appeared in the text because he's translating out of Latin, right? So now what happens is, in 1526, Tyndale is translating out of Greek, okay? And he thinks that charity is too much of a Catholic word because of its association with Latin. So Tyndale, every place essentially says what? Whoops, I don't want to. So Tyndale essentially every place said what? Love. There's a Catholic bishop who wrote a treatise in 1533 called A Treatise on Charity, where he basically rips Tyndale for saying love and not charity. Okay, I don't have that in front of me, but then a bunch of bishops, high church Anglican bishops, decide in a 1572 revision of the Bishop's Bible to put charity back in at least like 28 spots. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So let me see if I can.
I mean, charity isn't used all that much in art, but I get the feeling that love is a more personal, intense feeling as opposed to charity that's more like a empathy or outgoing response to the masses kind of thing.
Okay, so what you're saying there is, this whole thing is debated a lot.
Yeah.
Okay, King James advocates will say it has to be charity. If it's not charity, it's wrong. It's an error. It's not communicating the exact sense. And I've heard that. I used to teach that myself until I actually, looked at it and studied what was going on. If you look up the word charity in the English dictionary, one of the definitions is love. Okay. Now, let me show you what I'm talking about here. So we have, what's that? So let's go to 1 Corinthians 13:1. So we'll search that out, and we're going to go to Wycliffe. So here's Wycliffe. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not what? Charity. What did Wycliffe have?
Charity.
He had charity, right? If we look at the whole chapter of Wycliffe. So here's 1 Corinthians 3:13 in Wycliffe. Though I speak with the tongues of men and have not charity, and of all faith, so that I could move hills from her place, and have not what? Charity. And if I depart all my goodies to the merits of 4 men, and if I something my body so that I burn, and if I have not what? Charity. And look at that. Profiteth. We were just talking about that, weren't we? Okay? It profiteth me nothing. Charity is patient. Charity envieth not. So it's we don't need to go any further, right? It's obvious that what did Wycliffe say every time? Charity. Right? Now why did he say it that way? Because he's translating out of what? Out of Latin. And the Latin word is ceteris or something like that, which translates into English most directly as what? Charity. So now Tyndall, he is going to sit down with the Greek, and he is a Protestant who cannot stand the Catholic Church, and he likes to put it to what? Love. So that's the answer. And there's probably people watching this who are going to not like my answer, but that's my answer. Because that is, in my opinion, the factual issue. Yeah.
And isn't there different kinds of love? Say the love you have for someone you're married to is different than the love you have for a neighbor or a friend
Or
or a child. So charity is a little bit different than the different kinds of love, right?
Well, the thing about that argument would be simply the idea that Wycliffe made no distinction. He put charity essentially every time. There are a few instances or occurrences where he used love, but if you look at all the times that occurred in the text, almost the overwhelming, I would say 90 to 95% of the times that I looked at, Wycliffe had charity, not love.
In the Greek, it was always, excuse me, always the same word, right?
Yes. Yep. So here, let's do this. So we'll search charity, just so you can look at this from a different angle. So here are all the occurrences of charity in the King James. Okay. So if I turn the tools on here, and I find where charity is listed here. Now this is the kind of stuff people get mad at me for doing, because they think I'm correcting or undermining a King James Bible by looking at these things, which to me, I just think I don't accept that. I think that's goofy talk. Okay, so here's agape. Where'd it go? There's agape. If we click that, it will show us every time agape appears in the text. Okay, and we see that where's the first occurrence of agape in the New Testament? Matthew 24, verse 12, right? So let's go back and let's look at Wycliffe. So we'll switch the verse. We'll look at Matthew 24, 12. Whoops. Matthew 24, 12. What's it say? Charity. Now, I'm just grabbing a few random ones to show you the sense of what I'm talking about, right? Wycliffe used charity what? Almost every time. Not every time, almost every time. Because he's translating out of what? Out of Latin, right? So, Tyndall comes along, translating out of Greek, and he renders it love and doesn't use charity because he thinks charity is too Catholic of a word. because it's tied to the Latin text. And of course, the Latin text is tied to the Catholic Church, and he chooses to use love every time. So, that's a long-winded way of answering your question, Bart, but hopefully it made sense to you.
What was the common usage pretty synonymous back then? Because today you use charity and it's more like a handout or.
Yeah, the common usage was definitely way more synonymous back then than it is now. Today you say charity and people think you're, giving a maltrotter or something, right? Yeah, that's the meaning today is not necessarily what the meaning was then. Okay?
Because even though I grew up with the King James version, that was always the chapter of love.
Yeah.
So.
All right, any other questions about that? So Mike's got this book over here. You want to hold that up, Mike? He's got a modern spelling edition of the Bishops. And when he brought that in the first Sunday, I said, is that a 1568 or a 1572? And he looked at me cross-eyed. And I said, well, we can check. So the first place I went was to 1 Corinthians 13. Because I wanted to see if that had love or if it had what? Charity. If it had love, that meant it was it was based on an original 1568 bishops. If it had charity, that meant it would have been based on the 1572 what? Revised Bishop's Bible, right? What does it have in it, Mike?
Love.
It has love in it. So the gentleman that put that together, the editor who put that together, was using the original 1568 Bishop's Bible to put that together. If he had been using a 1572 or a 1602, he would have had charity in that passage and not what?
Love.
And not love. Okay? All right, let's at least finish this point. So page 4, we're under the table now. Under the table. So, the Bishop's Bible also utilized its fair share of obsolete words, even by the standards of the late 16th century. Condit says the following about this, quote, "The Bishop's Bible, however, has its share of obsolete words, such as besom." You know what a besom is?
No.
It's a broom. Flaw, or flay. How would you say that? F-L-A-W-E. Flay, flaw? I would say flaw. It means blast. I love this one, hucklebone. Hucklebone was a word to refer to your hip bone. Okay? I don't even know how to pronounce the next one. Kenecheth. Kenecheth was a word that meant cutteth off at the neck. All right? Pillars or pilers, extortioners. Prevented means anticipated. Now that word's also in the King James Bible, by the way. Or overtake. Quarine or mill for grinding. And then room, used as a word for kingdom. Okay? So you can look at the list. Let's go to the next page. You can see this list. So here we got Genesis. The first one is from Genesis 32, verse 25. He smoteth him upon the hucklebone of his thigh. Okay, so let's go to your King James. Go to Genesis 32, verse 25. Genesis 32, verse 25. So King James says, "And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh. And the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with him." The bishop says what? Smote him upon the hucklebone of his thigh. And hucklebone in that usage is talking about his hip bone. Okay? You got Isaiah chapter, what would this be? 14, verse 23. "And I will sweep them out with the besom of destruction." Let's go to Isaiah 14 and look at verse 23. So the Bishop's Bible is using older forms of speaking I think it's absolutely, to me, when you go, I'm not gonna be able to find it probably quickly now, maybe I can, okay. When you look at what Tyndall had here, not Tyndall, Wycliffe, and you see that he's using profiteth, that's almost 300 years before the King James Bible, that he's using that extended verb ending, right? So this bishop's Bible is using all the older forms and manners of speaking. It's using older vocab and so forth, right? Where I tell you to go?
Isaiah.
Isaiah 14, verse 1. Somebody read that quick for the sake of time if you have it.
I will also make it a possession for the bittern and pools of water, and I will sweep it with the besom of destruction, saith the Lord of hosts.
So the King James retains the word what?
Besom.
Besom. So there are they retaining the obsolete word for broom?
Yeah.
They did not make that choice first. Who made it first? Well, as far as we know, at least the bishops did, right? The bishops used besom, and was the bishops the base text for the King James?
Yes.
And so did they say, oh, this is a terrible word, besom, no one's going to understand that, we need to switch that to broom? It's obviously not what they did, right? Let's look at, you're in Isaiah, so let's see, the next one would be what, 47? Is that right? I got 47 on the Roman numerals for the next one. No?
That's correct.
That's correct. 47 verse 2. So Isaiah 47. We got Isaiah 47 verse 2. So reading from the notes. Bring forth the, how would you say this word that starts with a Q? Quorin? What? Quornin? And grind meal. King James. Take the what? Millstones. And grind what? So in that case, does the King James update the word? Yeah, kind of glad they did, because I have no idea what that would, okay. Let's see, Isaiah 66, right? Isaiah 66, go to Isaiah 66, and let's look at verse 3. Isaiah 66, verse 3. Now this one is important. He that killeth a sheep for me, kennecheth, I'm in the right verse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He that killeth a sheep for me, kennecheth a dog. What does this say?
Cut it off the neck of it off.
Killeth an ox.
But the part we're talking about, notice what it says. He sacrificeth a lamb as if he cutteth off a dog's neck. Kennecheth is the old word that means to cut off, to kill by removing the head, right? Or to cut off the head. So kennecheth is in the bishops, but it's removed in the King James, and it just says what the word means, right? In the dog to, what's it say? Cut off a dog's what? Neck. And then I want to go to John 11:48. John 11:48. So you can see here, guys, hopefully, is the King James sometimes retaining the old ways, the old vocab, the old words, and sometimes is it electing to update it? Just depends on the reading and what their thoughts were. Now, unfortunately, I wish we knew more about why they thought certain things, but we can only go off of the evidence that we have, okay? So John 11, verse 48. It says, and the Romans shall come and shall take away both our room and the people. That's what the bishops has. Okay? So we need verse 48, right? 11:48. Says in the King James, and I will let him thus alone, all men will believe on him, and the Romans shall come and take away our what? Place and nation. So is there a change there in the King James?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we can look at some of these other ones here, but I think that you guys get the point, right? So, does anybody have any questions about, we don't have time to get into the next point. So, spent a lot of time talking about that charity love question. I'm not upset that we did, because I think it's important for people to see that information. What I'll probably do then is take this last point on Parker, the post-Parker fortunes of the Bishop's Bible. I'll probably take this point and move it forward into the next lesson. And we'll probably start there when we get to the next lesson, which will be fine. It might make the next lesson make more sense. So let me just talk to you kind of about what the point of all this was. The point of all this is the following, right? What is the base text for your King James Bible? The Bishop's Bible, the 1602, which is based upon the 1572 revision, right? The Bishop's Bible, is it on purpose retaining old forms and old manners of speaking? Yes. Okay. So then that is the text that is handed to the King James as their base text. And the King James retains a lot of the older forms of speaking. Sometimes they update words, like getting rid of kenecheth. Sometimes they keep the word, like keeping bisum. It just depends on the choices that they're making based upon what they think makes the most sense and accurately conveys the sense, right? But it's important to note this because there's a lot of people that think that the King James translators came up with all this stuff on their own. And I want you to see that is there a precedent in the English language, particularly in the English Bible, for the English Bible reading and sounding the way or in similar ways to what we identify the King James Bible as using in terms of vocabulary and forms and manners of speaking. Okay? So, anybody got any questions or comments about any of that? I'm telling you right now, this thing about charity love, this will throw a lot of people into a hissy fit probably, because there's a lot of traditional thinking about it, because the King James has charity in these 28 places, and the modern version has what? Love. And so, there's a lot of stuff that's said therefore about that, to try to justify verbatim identicality, and essentially is what it is, right? That it can't say anything other than charity or it would be wrong. Well, then that would mean that Tyndale got it wrong, and the Geneva Bible got it wrong, and all of those other Bibles got it wrong until a bunch of high Anglican bishops, which by the way, most King James advocates aren't going to like that. That's going to be an inconvenient truth, that the change was made by high Anglican bishops. But that's where those readings came from that made it into where? The King James Bible. Okay? All right, any other questions?
That word love, when Jesus is talking to Peter at the end, almost at the end there, and he says, "Lovest thou me?" And Peter says, I love you. And Jesus says, "Well, feed my lambs." And a lot of people will say that, Jesus said it 3 times, and each time it's a different type of love. What do you think of that?
What's the reference on that?
I don't know offhand.
It's feed my lambs.
Yeah. Oh, here it is. John 21.
What verse?
15. Start with 15.
Oh, not 75. Sorry.
Huh?
21, 15,
He
16,
wrote
17.
25.
Oh.
25 up there. Instead of 15.
Oh.
15, 16, 17.
Okay, so you're talking about this verse right here?
21:15.
Okay, so let's look and see if we can understand at least why people are saying that, right? So here's verse 15. Lovest thou me? Verse 25, it's a form of agape, but it's not agape. Agape's Greek word number 26. So there's one Greek word for love, right? So right now we're just counting the words associated with this. Then notice this next time love occurs, you have a different Greek word. Phileo.
Brotherly love.
Second Greek word associated with love in this passage. Okay, so let's go to the next verse. Verse 26.
17.
What did I say?
26.
Okay, wait a minute. So verse 16 is what I meant to say. Is there love in verse 16?
Jesus said lovest, and Peter said love in response.
So Simon, son of Jonas, lovest thou me, right? Notice what it is again for lovest thou. It's that same word, verse number 25. Okay? And then we've got I love, is phileo again. Or is that the same verse we just looked at?
So every time so far Jesus says loveth, he's talking about agape.
Jesus says lovest, and Peter says love
Yes.
in response.
So here's lovest,
So the loveth is
phileo. Phileo again. Phileo again, I love thee. And that's where that ends, right? Verse 17? Or does it go into verse 18 as well? So right now I count, this, I might have missed something, okay? But I count at least 2 different Greek words that are associated with love. So Ernie, when people talk about that issue, that's usually why they're talking about it, because they're looking behind the English and they're identifying that there are different words that are being used in Greek to talk about in this conversation, that John is writing by inspiration to just have this conversation with Peter. And so they'll talk about that. I'll give you my opinion is that I am not sure what I think about that. I think I can objectively see what's going on with the different words, but whether or not that somehow substantively means certain things, I'm not sure about.
fair enough.
So, yeah, I don't really know what else to say about that. I understand why people say things like that, and I can look and see that there are different words associated with the word love in that passage, and then people will make a big deal about it in the way that they explain or exposit the passage. I'm just not sure that, I'm not sure that I think all that is, I'm not sure all the things that are said because of that are true. I just don't know. So I'm going to tell you I don't know rather than make something up and tell you things that I'm just speculating about. Anything else? I don't know what you guys think, but I think it's pretty cool that we now have the ability to actually go and look at stuff that you guys are asking questions about, right? When Bart raises the question there about charity, to actually go and look at, well, here's what Wycliffe had, and here's why this is the way that it is, I think it helps a lot for you to understand and see what's going on, okay?
Did the old Texans have, in their notes or did they explain what some of these obsolete words were for the people of the day, or?
Most probably not. I mean,
The Geneva did.
the Geneva did more so than probably the bishops. But it's